I'd like to acknowledge we now have quorum again and we'll restart the meeting. I'd like at this time to invite Jim Valen, Deputy General Counsel, to present on the proposed regulation amendments to 105 CMR 315, cremation of bodies received from outside Massachusetts. Jim?
Thank you, Commissioner. Good morning, council members. My name is Jim Valen, Deputy General Counsel at the Department of Public Health. I'm here to present proposed amendments to 105 CMR 315, that's entitled Cremation of Bodies Received from Outside Massachusetts. So I'm going to very briefly go over some background, discuss the proposed amendments, and then take any questions after that. All right, so as you've noticed, this is a very short regulation. It's one page. It's actually all 6 sentences. We're proposing to cut it down to actually about 3 sentences. It's also a very old regulation. It was promulgated originally in 1907. The last record we have of any amendments was in 1918. So it is appropriate for us to be reviewing at this point.
That's a century.
It's been a while. This is, as you may have guessed, one of the regulations we identified as part of the Governor's Regulatory Review Executive Order. The purpose of the regulation is to specify requirements related to the cremation of bodies of people who died outside of Massachusetts but are being transferred for cremation in Massachusetts. The regulation implements the requirements of Chapter 114, Section 44 of the General Laws relating to medical examiner review of a death occurring out of state prior to cremation in Massachusetts. All right, so a little more background. This section I just mentioned provides that a deceased person's body may not be cremated until a certificate from a medical examiner or a similarly authorized person states that the body has been reviewed. No further examination or judicial inquiry is necessary. This is for obvious reasons that cremation destroys all forensic evidence. In 1980, the law was amended to specifically allow the review to be done by a medical examiner in the state where the death occurred. However, unfortunately, the regulation was never updated. So the current regulation does not allow for the review to be conducted by an out-of-state medical examiner in lieu of the mass medical examiner. So technically, there's a little bit of conflict between the regulations and the statute, which is one of the things that we wanted to fix in these proposed amendments. So, very briefly, there are really only 4 changes that we want to make. And I do want to mention that we consulted with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner on these proposed amendments, as well as the Mass Cemetery Association. The first change is really just to add the word forensic investigator in addition to medical examiner. Again, that was at the suggestion of the General Counsel for the medical examiner, because under other state law, Chapter 38, Section 14, forensic investigator is also authorized to review a body for cremation. So to be consistent with state law, we've added forensic investigator to the regulations. The second amendment is to allow the review of the body prior to cremation to be conducted by either the medical examiner or forensic investigator in Massachusetts or in the state where the death occurred. And as I mentioned before, that's really just to make sure that the regulations are not consistent with current state law. Number 3 here is we were suggesting to delete a provision in the regulation that exempts a review if the death occurred more than 10 years ago. This is obviously would be a very rare occurrence, and in discussions with the medical examiner's office, we had no understanding as to why this provision was put in there, but at their suggestion, we have proposed removing it because their opinion is that all bodies should be reviewed before cremation, which is the current practice. And finally, we're just fixing a few statutory citation errors. And that's pretty much it. As I said, the 6 sentences are now going to go down to 3 sentences, so at least we have a pretty concise regulation. Next steps, finally, we will go out to public hearing. We will collect any comments, review those, and be back before you to request approval for a final promulgation. So happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Jim on this preliminary regulation?
I just have one driven by pure curiosity. Do you have any sense of how frequently this occurs?
Well, in terms of bodies being transferred to Massachusetts for cremation, it does occur. In several bordering states, particularly we're aware of a practice in Vermont that does arrange for the transfer of bodies to Massachusetts for cremation. And part of the reason for this law is every bordering state has some different rules. New Hampshire actually has a law that does not allow for the transfer of a body out of state without review of a medical examiner, but we're not sure every state does. So this actually just adds a little layer of protection to make sure that no one is brought to Massachusetts and cremated without this very important review by the medical examiner.
Any other questions for Jim? Okay, Jim, thank you. At this time, council members, I'm going to go out of order. That was the first preliminary regulation. I very much want you to hear their preliminary regulation on lead, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip first to the final regulation. And at this time, I ask Jim to stay at the table and invite Mike Pantella, Director of the Massachusetts State Public Health Lab, Roger Eaton, Director of the New England Newborn Screening Program, and Anne Lowe, Deputy Director of the New England Newborn Screening Program, to the table to present to the council on the final promulgation proposed amendments 105 CMR 270, regulations pertaining to the blood screening of newborns for treatable diseases and disorders.
Thank you. So I'm just going to give you a very quick review of the presentation that was presented to you in February to facilitate your vote. Yes.
Just went the wrong way. There you go.
Okay. So we'll go over some background and those specifics of the change. So background, newborn screening is a long-standing and successful public health service designed to identify babies with treatable conditions prior to irreversible clinical sequelae. The disorders and diseases that are included in newborn screening are defined by the Commissioner and Public Health Council after determination by the Commissioner's Advisory Committee on Newborn Screening. The Commissioner has the authority to mandate which conditions are screened in all newborns in Massachusetts, and for some disorders that do not quite meet the criteria for mandatory screening, the Commissioner has the authority to offer screening on a pilot basis to do studies on these conditions. Currently, there are 30 disorders that are required screening for Massachusetts newborns. The specific changes to the regulations include the following. We made changes to some definitions, mostly for clarity as to who might be responsible, clearly defining healthcare provider who are responsible for collecting the specimens versus, for instance, healthcare providers to whom we are allowed to give data. There is also some changes to mandated screening. The advisory committee has voted to add 2 conditions that were previously on study to the mandated list. They are SCID and CACT. And the list of pilots will now be available on our website and in our brochure, but will not be included in regulation. Other proposed amendments include the timing of newborn screening, a change from 24 to 72 hours collection. Is now going to be 24 to 48 hours collection of the specimen, and that is to align with timeliness, optimal outcomes for our disorders. The procedures for opting out of newborn screening for religious exemption are clearly defined in these regulations and include a form that will be provided to all hospitals that the hospitals will be required to collect if the parents want to opt out of mandatory testing. The hospitals will also be required to provide information to parents about the optional testing. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Do I need to go backward or am I? There are specifications and clarifications on confidentiality and what the newborn screening program is allowed to do with regard to providing information to providers who, for instance, may call into the program looking for information on a particular baby. There are clarifications on the storage and use of residual specimens. So once the specimens have been used for the mandatory testing, how we are allowed to use them, store them, quality control purposes, and all of this aligns with new federal recommendations. Parents will be allowed to request destruction of their child's residual newborn screening specimen. So after the presentation to Public Health Council in February of 2016, there was a public comment period. We received no comment, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, or my colleagues at the table certainly be happy to discuss any questions you may have.
Thank you, and does anyone have any questions? If not, then I'd like to ask for a motion to approve the amendments to the newborn screening regulations. Have a motion, please. Dr. Rosenthal, a second. Dr. Bernstein, all approve?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstain? Thank you. We accept the amendment to the newborn screening regulation. Thank you very much. Thank you. At this time, I'd like to ask Paul Hunter, Director of the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program within the Bureau of Environmental Health, and Anisha Frazier, Assistant Director of the Environmental Epidemiology Program within the Bureau of Environmental Health, to the table to brief the Council on proposed amendments 105 CMR 460, the regulations that govern lead poisoning prevention and control. Paul?
Thank you. Good morning to Commissioner Burrell and the members of the council. I'd like to quickly just state that I want to thank Commissioner Burrell and her leadership team for her support with this very important issue, as well as the leadership of the Bureau of Environmental Health over the past year. And most importantly, I want to thank the staff of the lead program for all they do. We are here today to discuss several potential proposed changes to the lead poisoning prevention regulations. This is after a long period of review and consideration of several factors. To begin, I would like to emphasize that obviously there is no safe level of lead, but in an industrialized society, there's no possibility of every child or any individual having a lead level of 0. I would also like to suggest that the current lead law requires any home in Massachusetts where a child under the age of 6 resides in a dwelling built before 1978 needs to be in compliance with our regulations. So the intention is to prevent lead poisoning, which is a serious medical and environmental problem. It's clearly been associated with several adverse outcomes, including school performance, violence, incarceration, teen pregnancy, and several other areas that would be concerns of social determinants of health. The other important issue to consider in terms of lead poisoning is the issue as a health disparity issue. And without going too much into statistical data and analysis, we define high-risk communities in Massachusetts by looking at poverty, age of housing, incidence, etc. And 60% of all the children who have been identified with lead poisoning reside in one of 22 communities in Massachusetts. Those 22 communities make up only a third of the population. So clearly this is an issue that impacts poor and older communities more than others. Just again as background, I'm proud to say that Massachusetts has always been considered a leader in lead poisoning prevention. Our statute was first promulgated and passed in 1971. We have since been the leader in several areas to increase prevention in Massachusetts. We were the first state to have universal mandatory screening that requires every child to be tested first between 9 and 12 months, again at age 2 and at age 3, and lastly at age 4 if they live in one of the 22 high-risk communities. We were also, again, the first to require the licensing and training of both lead paint inspectors in the public and private sector, and letting contractors and others doing lead paint abatement. We also have been fortunate since 1988, the Department of Housing and Community Development and Mass Housing have provided financial assistance for the cost of lead abatement. Since that time, we have provided $90 million of assistance to Massachusetts property owners. So again, we have a long and important history here, but we still have some significant issues that we would like to address. Despite what you might hear these days about things like Flint, Michigan and other issues, although it's not unimportant, we still firmly believe that most lead poisoning is directly attributed to lead-based paint and dust that is generated through the deterioration of lead paint. Other sources such as soil, water, toys, food are important to be considered, but it is primarily lead paint in older housing that we should be concerned with. Massachusetts has the fourth highest, oldest housing stock in the country, with well over 70% of all Massachusetts housing built before 1978, when the Consumer Product Safety Act was amended to eliminate the use of lead in residential house paint. So we have a long way to go. Our data, we require the reporting of all lead inspections and leading, and our data indicates that approximately 10% of Massachusetts dwellings have been inspected, and only 5% of all housing has been leaded. So we still have a lot of work in front of us. And we still have a significant burden in terms of childhood lead poisoning. In the last calendar year, there were over 3,700 children in Massachusetts identified at levels that we would be considered a level of concern or higher. And there were over 600 children identified with levels of 10 micrograms or higher, which is what we would suggest requires intervention. So again, and in Massachusetts, the screening rate for children 9 to 48 months is 76%. In calendar year 2015, we tested over 175,000 children. And just again, somewhat hard to see because of the light coloring, but I think you can see from this the progress that's been made, which has been significant over the last decade. But you can also see by the final column that we still have a lot of work that needs to be done, and that we're proposing ways that we hope that we can decrease that number either even further moving forward. The proposed amendments that we're here to discuss today were really informed by several factors. One was Executive Order 562, which required all state agencies to review regulations to determine if they were still necessary and appropriate, or whether perhaps they needed amendments. So that certainly factored into our decision. We were also fortunate in calendar year 2015, using funds from the Centers for Disease Control, we established an expert medical panel with physicians from Children's Hospital Medical Center, Boston Medical Center, and Bay State Healthcare, all experts in lead with many, many years of service. And they produced a white paper in August of 2015. Many of the recommendations that they made are consistent with what we're proposing today. We also are required by statute to have a governor's advisory committee established by the governor. They met twice in June of this year, considered the proposals that we're proposing today, and were very supportive of all of those suggestions. And in addition to those state factors that help to drive our decisions, we were also looking closely at what's recommended by the Centers for Disease Control and the Federal Office of Housing and Urban Development, both of whom are significantly engaged in lead poisoning prevention. So again, and I'm happy to share the outcomes with folks, but the medical panel, the CDC currently has established a quote reference value for lead poisoning that identifies children at 5 micrograms or higher as being in the top 2.5% of children identified through the NHANES or National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. So again, they avoid using the term lead poisoning, but certainly 5 and above is areas that we would want to be concerned with. They also recommend venous confirmation of elevated blood lead testing, which is another important factor, particularly as we look at lower levels of lead exposure. Okay, here we go, sorry. So what we're here to discuss specifically today is several potential changes in the regulatory conditions that currently drive lead poisoning prevention. First and foremost, we're suggesting that we lower the definition of lead poisoning, which in the current regulations is 25 micrograms per deciliter. We're proposing that definition be changed to 10. All of those tests would require venous confirmation. At that level, we would mandate environmental intervention and abatement. We are also considering changing the definition of what is currently stated as a lead level in excess of a level considered dangerous to a child's health, which is quite a tongue twister. So what we're suggesting is a new definition of a level of concern, which would be for any child with a blood lead between 5 and 9 micrograms, to assure that they received education and follow-up to hopefully prevent them from having blood leads rise to a level of poisoning or greater. Next, and somewhat related to the definition of lead poisoning, is concern about the primary use of capillary lead screening, which is an appropriate screening tool. But what we've seen when we analyze data from 2011 and 2012 is that for several thousand blood lead levels that were 10 or greater by capillary, only 27% of them were actually confirmed as in fact above 10. This creates unnecessary concern and trauma for the family. It requires additional doctor and laboratory visits that come at no slight expense. So what we're suggesting is a change in our regulations that currently suggest that venous confirmatory testing is recommended. We're suggesting that that language be changed to require that elevated capillary blood test of 5 or greater be retested with venous confirmation.